All right, let's get started.
Thank you all for your patience. My little laptop was struggling with the browser version or whatever of this thing, and perhaps you have too. So we'll get into the business of the Office of Public Accountability's report quickly. I'm Tony Wilkinson. You are at the Neighborhood Council, Department of Water and Power Memorandum of Understanding Oversight Committee meeting on the first Saturday of every month at 8:30. We meet at this link. You can find it at this DWP site that you clicked on to come here, whatever the month is, it'll be the current link. What this meeting is dedicated to is that in 5 years ago, the city started a process to determine what it would take for the department to get to 100% renewable energy. The department put together a magnificent effort with the U.S. Department of Energy. It's the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. That process was completed in March of this year, 2021. And part of the process is that the results of the study are not a plan. They are a selection of options, and it's now up to the department and the city to choose the options and paths to reach renewable energy. And during this 5-year period, to tell you the truth, cost was not discussed until the day after the mayor's press conference, when we had our last advisory group meeting, and finally the matter of how much does it cost was brought up. So this is part of the original motion. One of the amendments asked for the Office of Public Accountability to weigh in on the study, its impact on rates, and particularly its impact on lower income ratepayers. And so now you have Dr. Fred Pickle with his preliminary, it hasn't gone to the board yet, his preliminary report on his perspective on the costs and rate impacts and some of the choices that the city would make that are relative to those for the 100% renewable study. Hopefully this meeting will begin a public dialogue on this issue because it's not a slam dunk. There's a lot of work to do, including the department's strategic long-term resource plan, which now needs to incorporate this material. So let me just give it to you, Fred, and thank you very much. You got the meeting. Hopefully we'll have some time for a few questions and answers at the end. We have to end before 10 o'clock because we've got the Los Angeles Neighborhood Council Coalition following us. So thanks a lot.
Good morning. As we looked at the results from this study, we wanted to piece apart the cost buildup and possible waypoints along the investment path where we could look at the costs at various stages in time rather than just looking at 2045, because the IRS doesn't think I'm going to be around in 2045, and I should plan accordingly. And I assume many of the others of us have horizons that are shorter than 2045. So we're looking forward over time as to how this would unfold. We asked Bruce Shishida of the Brattle Group, together with Sylvia Tang, to do this analysis. And Bruce, you've heard from before. He did the OPA review of the once through cooling study draft that was released by DWP only in draft. And so we wanted to take a look at that. An important thing to understand about the NREL study is they started their study based on assumptions for 2030 and went forward from there. We wanted to take a look at some of the intermediate points like 2025 on that path as well. So I'll turn this over to Bruce. I will turn this over to Bruce and Sylvia. Bruce, you can share your screen now. or Sylvia. You'll share the screen and turn the pages for Bruce.
And if any of us are not muted, there's a gray mute button at the bottom. So we ask everybody to mute their microphones while we're hearing the presentation.
And well, we have a lot to go through. If there are immediate questions of understanding, let us know. For longer questions, we'll hold toward the end.
Okay, thank you, Fred. Thank you for the introduction and Tony. And so we've got 84 slides. I'm not going to cover it all. Part of the 84 slides is redundant. We created the 80 something slides to kind of walk through the analysis, and all the information and the data sources are included in the footnote if anyone wants to replicate it, so that things are very, very transparent. We'll go through select slides, roughly 30 or 40, so that I can release you guys within an hour or maybe an hour and 15 minutes. But there's quite a lot of volume, so let's move ahead to slide 2. Slide 2 shows the table of contents. The whole report or the whole presentation has give or take 6 sections. The introduction, which we'll go through pretty heavily, and then we have a section that's about half of the whole document that discusses the cost and GHG reduction. And then we talk about rate impacts, and then we follow up with paths and uncertainties, because there's so much uncertainty going on in the future. And finally, we come up with a small section of suggestions and recommendations and appendices. Well, we've been using the appendices as for background information, but also for additional analysis that stakeholders requested as we presented this through different venues. So if there's anything that you want to see that's not in the deck as of now, please let us know. We can try to add it if the effort's not that humongous. But by all means, we're sharing the entire deck so that people can go back and forth, while today we'll only go through the slides that has the yellow triangle on the upper right-hand side. Next slide, please. Slide 4. Sorry, slide 3, I'm sorry. Oh, slide 4. So we'll start with the introduction of the study, and many of you are familiar with the study, but I just want to go through it once more so that there's no one lost in the nomenclature or what the whole study was about, or what we mean by pathways. The LA 100 study was performed by NREL with the LA DWP team and with the advisory group members, and it looked for different pathways to achieve 100% clean energy by 2045. The pathways per se are not carved in stone, but they're rather a range of possibilities that can result from different decisions and investment choices depending on what you see the future world to be. And they're a combination of 4 scenarios and 3 load projections. The load projections are high load, moderate load, and then we have another one that's called stress load. And we'll look at that in the next slide. What we also did, and we asked NREL to do, was to look at the latest IRP from DWP, the SLTRP 2017. And the reason for that was, if we just show the NREL study results, it's very hard to connect those starting points from where we are today. So we asked NREL to create a modified version of the SLTRP and show the results together with the LA 100 study pathways, so that people can relate those different pathways from where we are today. The SLTRP 2017 is the latest IRP that DWP developed. A few of the modifications that we added were the clean energy targets. We increased it a little bit. The electric vehicle adoptions, electrification projections, and finally the OTC retirements. In the SLTRP 17, the OTCs were going to be repowered, but in this case, we assumed that they will be retired and replaced with alternative resources. So those are the modifications that we applied to the SLTRP 2017, but it's included in many of the presentations just so that you can kind of see how we're evolving from where we are today to the future world that NREL projected. Next slide. This probably is familiar with most of you. There's 4 scenarios on the left-hand side. SB 100, which is the current law that targets 100% retail sales. by 2045, that means it's not total generation. If there's a 10% loss on the transmission and distribution network, you can basically say, okay, that 10% can come from gas or other means, but it's 100% retail sales by 2045. The early and no biofuels scenario is the most aggressive one. It's designed to meet 100% by 2035. The other two, whether it's transmission focus or limited new transmission, are targeted to achieve 100% by 2045. And I think the namings by themselves will give you a rough feel of what the scenarios are. On the right-hand side, we've got the demand projection and electrification. We got the moderate load that includes a certain amount of energy efficiency and electrification. The high load assumes a much more widespread effort on the decarbonization of building and transportation. So there's more electrification, and as a result, there's higher electric load. The stress load assumes that you get the electrification as much as the high load, but you don't get the energy efficiency and demand response. And as a result, you're getting high electrification load, but low response from the existing assets, and thereby you're stressing the system to provide more from LADWP. In all, there's 9 combinations that you see in the middle of this table, of this slide, that starting from SP 100 moderate all the way down to limited transmission high. Throughout the presentation, we'll keep the color scheme where SP 100 is red, early and no biofuel. The most aggressive scenario is green. Transmission focus is yellow. Limited transmission is navy. And furthermore, moderate load is in regular text. High load is with underlined. Stress load is italicized. And we'll keep that constant. So if you get confused, please come back to slide 5 to see what the scenarios are. Next slide. So one more thing, the LA 100 study is looking to clean up the energy sector in terms of power production. So it measures a lot of greenhouse gas emission. There's multiple ways of measuring it. The first thing is you can measure the greenhouse gas for the power sector, or you can include the other sectors, including the transportation and buildings that your electrification effort is going on. So you need to be aware of that. Within the power sector, you have carbon emission from combustion-related carbon emission. That's the amount of carbon that you emit because you burn natural gas or coal or whatever fuel, versus the non-combustion power sector emission, which are attributable to those that include the manufacturing process or the fuel transportation process or construction process or whatnot. That's really not within the control of LADWP. For example, when you create cement, there's a lot of CO2 being created through that process. That goes into the second non-combustion sector within the power sector. And then overall, you can measure greenhouse gas measurements in multiple ways. One way to look at it is to say, okay, how much do I emit or how much did I reduce in 2025? Another way to look at it is how much did I reduce in total between now and 2025? So you can see that there's multiple ways of measuring it. And associated with that, there's multiple ways of measuring the cost. So if you look at one snapshot in 2025, you can say, how much did it cost me in 2025 to reduce it down to the 2025 level? An alternative way to say it is, well, you can't really just do it in one shot. So you need to look at the total investment that you made through 2025 to get to that level. Or you can say, okay, how much did I reduce entirely between 2021 and 2025? What was the total cost? So there's multiple ways of slicing and dicing it. The presentation shows all that, but today we'll just go through a few of those so that you get the bigger picture without going too much into the details. Next slide. The positive side of the study is that the study confirmed that you can achieve 100% clean energy by 2045 while maintaining reliability. One of the observations that we made was, regardless of the pathways, most of the significant reduction of greenhouse gas is achieved by 2030 or 2035. After 2030 or 2035, the reduction in carbon is not there, but the cost goes up significantly. So without defining what the break line is, I'll oftentimes refer to as the first half and the second half of the study. But in many cases, I'll show you numbers between now and 2030 or now and 2035, and then from 2030 to 2045 or 2035 to 2045. and call them loosely the first half and the second half. Another observation is that the electrification of the transportation and building sectors are as important as the power sector is for decarbonization. The electricity demand is likely to continue to grow, and electrification will propel that growth, but a lot of energy efficiency will offset that power usage. But with that said, the electrification of the other sectors, the transportation and the buildings, actually leads to the largest improvements in air quality and associated benefits to health. These benefits, the health benefits, are actually widespread. It doesn't matter whether you have rooftop solars on your roof or someone else's roof. The health benefits are shared among everyone, so it contributes to potentially alleviating the EJ issues that people tend to bring up. Finally, the cost of electrification is not assessed as part of the LA 100 study. The cost of serving that additional load through power generated by LA DWP is included, but the cost of electrification, for example, the cost of you buying an electric vehicle or converting your gas stove at home to an electric stove, is not included. That is something that you may want to look into going forward, because that is a missing piece in the puzzle. We also observed that there's a huge amount of customer rooftops installed, especially in the second half, and it adds up to about 3 to 4 gigawatts by 2045. To give you in context, the peak load of LA DWP today is about 6 gigawatts. So you can see how much NREL is assuming that there's going to be customer installed rooftops. We'll park this for now, but it is kind of a question mark in my mind. We also observed that NREL assumed that the distribution network upgrade is needed, but the total cost is within about 1% or 2% of the total investment cost, which is in the $50 to $80 to $90 billion range. We've heard back from the LA DWP folks that this may not be true, and they're finding that the distribution cost may be a little bit higher, or sometimes much higher than what NREL projected, but we haven't seen numbers yet. So right now, I'll just stick to what we saw in the NREL study. Finally, the clean energy investment alone may not be notably impactful for the LA's economy. I mean, it does have a positive number, but the positive number is relatively small, so it's not big enough for you to jump up and down and say, let's go, it's going to create jobs. There's a positive impact, but it's not something to be too excited about. Next slide. So this slide summarizes what we observed. The table at the bottom has roughly 3 columns. The most left-hand column that says total clean energy penetration achieved under the blue banner shows how much clean energy penetration you achieved by 2030, 2035, or 2045. You can see that by 2030, you're already achieving somewhere between 80 to 90 to sometimes 100% clean energy, depending on the pathways. By 2035, you're pretty much achieving almost what you would achieve by 2045. So the way to look at it is that your clean energy goal will achieve roughly within the 2030 to 2035 timeframe. If you go to the middle column, the undiscounted cumulative cost shown in $1 billion shows that your cost, or the cost that NREL calculated for 2021 to 2035, is less than half of the total cost that you see on the most right-hand side. Or an alternative way to look at it is that the cost NREL estimate for the first 15 years, that's shown under 2021 to 2035, is less than the cost that NREL assumes for the last 10 years, 2036 to 2045. So what this says is that you're getting most of your clean energy achievements in the first half, either through 2030 or 2035, but the cost increases in the later half, where you're not getting much incremental benefits for clean energy. Finally, the most right-hand side numbers that range between, let's say, 8.5 to 11.5, is the amount of greenhouse gas emission you achieve through the different years and different pathways. Remember, as you see in the bottom of the table, the 2020 greenhouse gas emission from the power sector was assumed to be 12.8 million metric tons. By 2030, in most of the scenarios, you're achieving 9 or 10 million metric tons reduction. And by 2035, you're almost achieving 12 in certain scenarios. Again, the key point is you're achieving most of your greenhouse gas reduction by 2030 to 2035, but your cost keeps growing exponentially. Next slide, please. One of the reasons that you're not going to be achieving the entire 12.8 million metric ton reduction, regardless of the goal of achieving 100% clean energy, is because remember earlier we said within the power sector you got the combustion sector and the non-combustion sector. The non-combustion sector is associated with manufacturing and other activities that is outside of LADWP's control. So this slide shows how much you reduced from the power sector, the combustion part of the power sector, that's the most right-hand side of the table. The entire power sector, that includes the non-combustion portion, which is outside of anyone's control. And then how much you reduce for all the sectors, including transportation and the buildings that you electrified. If you compare the power sector to the power sector combustion, you see that there's not much of a difference, but the power sector is slightly higher. If you look at the all sector to the power sector, you can see that the all sector reduction is about 1.5 to 2 to sometimes 3 times higher than the power sector. So the electrification of buildings and transportation is what is contributing to this increase in the reduction. And you can see how effective that is. In fact, if you look at some of the scenarios towards the lower end, you can see that the all sector reduction is close to 2 to 3 times by 2045. For example, the limited new transmission high load shows close to 31 million metric tons of GHG emission compared to 2020 for all sectors, while it only shows 11 for power sector. So there's roughly a 3x multiplier there by electrifying other sectors rather than focus purely on the power sector. Let's go to the next slide. Finally, this is another important slide. The MOU study showed that the health benefits measured by the reduction of PM 2.5 is not necessarily dependent on the scenario. The chart here shows what the health benefits are for the SB100 moderate, SB100 high. SB100 is the most modest scenario, and the early and no biofuel moderate and early and no biofuel high pathways. The early and no biofuels are the most aggressive scenarios. Between these four different pathways, you can see that the benefits, the height of the bars is the same between the two moderate pathways, and it's the same between the two high load pathways, and the two high load pathways have about 1.5 times the benefit as the moderate pathways. The orange line in the middle is the net benefit after you subtract the blue chunk on the bottom, which accounts for the increase in annual emission produced by cooking, road dust, and whatever else there is. But you can see that, and I also added in the text that under the moderate load pathways, the annual benefits for health is about 900 million in 2045. But if you go to the high load scenarios, that increases by more than 1.5 times to 1.4 billion, a $500 million increase. And as you see in the chart, the huge amount of that increase is either the green portion, which is the buildings, or the yellow portion, which is the transportation. The power sector is that navy line that's slithering right above the zero mark. So you see how much benefit electrification of the other sectors have, and how little the power sector can do, partially because the power sector is already cleaned up pretty much, but it stresses the importance of electrifying other sectors. That is the overview, and I will pause here to address any questions you have up to this point, and after that, we'll go into the costs.
I don't understand this chart, the colors and stuff like that. This is on page 10. We're on.
Okay.
The colors are conflicted. I just don't understand it. Sorry.
Okay, so the height of the color is the amount of PM 2.5 emissions.
Reductions.
Reduction, sorry. Reduction. So the higher the bar, the more reduction you're having by the different pathways in 2045. There's a blue portion on the bottom. That's negative reduction, meaning it's additions. That is the increase of PM 2.5 emissions. The navy sliver right above the zero, that's the reduction from the power sector. The yellow block is the reduction from the transportation sector. The green on the top is the reduction from the building sectors. So if you compare the SB 100 moderate to the SB 100 high, the first two columns, you see that the power sector reduction is roughly the same. The transportation sector goes from about 600 plus in the moderate scenario to about 800 in the high scenario. The building is, I don't know, call it 100 or so in the moderate scenario to about 300 in the high scenario. That's how much you're reducing PM 2.5 by the different pathways.
If I can contribute to this too, we're living in a real world of public dialogue where there's a lot of dialogue. And what we're trying to do here is to look at facts and science. And the fact that the power sector reduction in particulates, those are parts per million of bad particulates in the air, is this tiny little blue line that you see, not the big blue chunk, but the little blue line. And so what we're hearing people saying with regard to 100% renewable energy, oh, people will be able to breathe better and look at all the health and environmental benefits from this. But we need to face the reality that the environmental benefits from reducing greenhouse gas emissions are not going to come mainly from the power sector because it's already relatively clean. It's going to come from transportation and buildings. And if you raise the cost of power unnecessarily, then you're going to lessen the rapidity with which we can transform transportation and buildings because power costs too much. So this is really a system. It's not a silo about 100% renewable power. And I think this is where this slide is going, particularly with regard to the so-called health benefits.
Jack, does that answer your question?
Not really. I mean, the colors just don't make sense. You mentioned the 1.4 million. The whole thing that I went through it last night. The whole thing is just too damn complicated for normal human beings. I mean, we didn't go to Caltech. We didn't go to MIT.
Yeah.
Jack, keep in mind that we've reduced the roughly 1,300 pages of the NREL study to 86, and we're trying to get it down to half that, less than half that. And it's important to look at the intermediate waypoints and separate out the impacts of the power generation sector from other things that are going on. Bruce, why don't you go ahead on the cost components?
Sure. Let's go to slide 14. Actually, go to slide 16 first. So slide 16 shows the cumulative costs by the different pathways. Again, SB 100 is in red, early and no biofuels in green, transportation is in yellow, and limited transportation is in navy. And anything that has high load is with a circle in the middle. Anything with a moderate load has a triangle in the middle. You can see that depending on the pathways, the cost starts diverging around 2030. After 2030, the costs diverge. At 2030, the cumulative cost is about $17 billion plus minus $3 billion. And By 2045, the average cost becomes closer to $70 billion, and the range is plus minus $20 billion. You can see how the pathways diverge after 2030, but the key point here is that costs are relatively controlled through 2030, and then it grows exponentially and spreads as you go in the later half of the year. And also, you can see that the cost between 2030 and 2045 is 3x or even more, 3 to 4x. So that is a key message. Remember earlier we said most of your greenhouse gas emission reduction will be achieved by 2030 or 2035, while the cost goes up afterwards. This chart basically shows how the cost is going. Also, one more thing is at the very bottom of the chart, right under the red line, you see that gray line, that is the SLTRP. So it shows that the cost growth through 2030 is roughly in line with the modified SLTRP, which is the basis or a modified version of the latest RP that you had. Let's go back 2 slides. One more. So this chart, the bar chart shows the cost by the cumulative cost for every 5-year segments. The first blue bar is from between today and 2025. The green bar is between today and 2030, followed by the yellow that goes to 2035, and so on and so forth. What we can see here, depending on the different scenarios, is that the cost through 2030, as we saw in the other chart, is roughly the same regardless of the path you take. They're all less than $20 billion. But then once you go from 2030 to 2035, again, regardless of the path you take, the cost is roughly doubling. So the height of the yellow bar, the third bar, is double that of the green bar, the second bar. And then if you compare 2035, the third bar, to 2045, the last bar, again, regardless of the scenario that you're looking at or the pathway, it doubles once more. So the cost is maintained through 2030, and then it doubles through 2035 and then doubles once more. So after 2030, your costs are just going exponentially. That is the key message that I wanted to show from this chart. And while the height of the bars may differ by the pathways, the trend does not. So let's go to the next slide, 15.
And these dollars are shown in 2019 dollars. They're not dollars that reflect overall inflation in the economy.
Yes. So what we tried to show here was how much of the expenditures are happening between now and 2030 and 2030 through 2045. That's the left chart. The right chart is also showing how much investment goes in between now and 2035 and 2035 through 2045. So the blue polka dot at the very top shows how much of investment is going in the later half, whether it's 2030 to 2045 or 2035 to 2045. If I focus on the left-hand chart, you see that the white numbers in the blue polka dot is somewhere between 75%. That means 75% of the total expenditure happens after 2030. Or a reverse way of saying it is that all the total amount of investment that you are incurring, if it goes all as the NREL plan outlays, is roughly a quarter through 2030. So the first 10 years only takes a quarter of your cost, and the last 15 years takes about 75% of your cost. If you split it at 2035, which is the right-hand side, you can see that the white numbers within the blue polka dots are above 50%. What this tells you is that the total share of the cost that you incur between now and 2035 is less than 50%, and the total cost that you go from 2035 to 2045 is more than 50%. And it just repeats what I said earlier. The cost between 2035 and 2045 doubles. One of the questions that came was, why was the 57 billion highlighted on slide 16? So let's go to slide, Sylvia, go back to slide 14. The 57 billion was highlighted because that was the numbers that was thrown around in one of the latest AG meetings, saying what is the base number that we're looking at. It is the SB 100 moderate scenario. Now, if you look at the other scenarios, the early and no biofuel, the most aggressive one, approaches 90 billion. So that's a 1.5x. But the 57 billion was just highlighted because that was the numbers that we all discussed I think it was back in March. So let's go to the next slide. We did this. Go to slide 17. Now, that was the total expenditure. We now looked at how much is split between CapEx and OpEx. CapEx in general was about 20%, plus minus 10% of the cost, and OpEx was about 80%, again, plus minus 10% of the cost. This was roughly consistent among all the different pathways, but there's a caveat here. LADWP assumed that the renewable projects will be built by third-party developers, and they will sign PPAs with those guys, and all that PPA cost was included in OpEx. It's not part of the CapEx. So keep that in mind that the renewable portfolio is included in OpEx. But in any case, the rough share is 20% CapEx and 80% OpEx. And
Bruce, can I make a quick
yes.
addition? PPAs under some interpretations of bankruptcy law are forward contracts, and forward contracts can survive bankruptcy. Just because expenditures are occurring in a later year in the PPAs, it doesn't mean you can escape those expenditures by bankruptcy. And bankruptcy law is complicated, so seek your own advice on bankruptcy law, not from me.
But that's why we're giving them to SCAPA and other places where we can hide them.
Okay.
This is about how you hide the money.
No, it's not that. It's an annual operating expenditure, but it's a pre-committed annual operating expenditure. So you got to watch those numbers.
Okay, let's go to slide 20. So within the CapEx, what we realized was that there's a huge portion that's being invested into renewable fuel gas turbines or combustion turbines. They're either hydrogen fueled or renewable fueled CTs. And the chart on the left shows what the share. The two blue boxes at the bottom shows the megawatts, sorry, the $1 million spent on these renewable fueled gas turbines on the left axis. The orange portion on the top shows how much is spent on transmission, and the yellow sliver at the top is how much is spent on distribution. The blue line actually shows the percentage share of the total CapEx that is dedicated to the renewable fuel combustion turbines. So the renewable fuel combustion turbines, the two blue boxes at the bottom, that adds up to about $7 billion by 2045, is about 50 to 60% of the total CapEx through all the years. And that seems to be roughly consistent among different scenarios, although for the limited transmission scenario, that increases a lot, perhaps because the lack of transmission is forcing you to build things within the basin, and because there's only so much solar and wind that you can build within the basin, you have to rely on these exotic technologies. Next slide, please. On the other hand, you can see that transmission is sharing about 40%, as we saw earlier, and the investment amount in transmission does not really change by the different pathways, with the exception of the transmission-focused pathways. So you can see in the table on the left-hand side that the transmission expenditure, about $300 million in 2025, $1.2 billion in 2030, 2.3 billion in 2035 is roughly consistent among the different pathways, again, with the exception of the yellow guy, the transmission focused one. And it's also consistent with SLTRP 2017. So our recommendation is keep investing in transmission because it allows you to diversify your portfolio for building new plants and avoiding those expensive combustion turbines. Those combustion turbines, if you look at the deck that we have at some page that we haven't highlighted today, only run between 1 to 5% of the time based on the OPEX. So you're spending a huge amount of CapEx while you're only spending about 1% of OPEX on those renewable combustion turbines. And they're not proven technology yet. I'm not saying LADWP should not look into that. They should look into it, but think twice before you invest in it immediately because it could lead to stranded costs. But in any case, the beauty of transmission is that it allows you to get a diverse generation portfolio for the long term because you can connect to more utility scale wind and solar outside the basin. It also gives the LADWP operational options because if one of the transmission paths, for example, is disabled because of wildfires or some other events, you can revert to another path and import power. So it helps in both the long and short term. Furthermore, if you think about the utility scale renewables versus rooftops, utility scale renewables are typically half, a third, or a quarter of the cost on a per megawatt hour basis compared to distributed energy resources. So by adding more transmission, it's allowing you to get cheaper power from elsewhere. And further, when you import power through transmission, that benefit is shared among all the ratepayers, not only those who have rooftop solars. So it also contributes to environmental justice issues. So one of our recommendations that we came through was keep investing in transmission because it's probably a no regret investment. And finally, if you think there's risk in developing transmission, for example, the future load may not grow and the transmission may not be needed anymore, then co-developing that with neighbor utilities may be a good way to potentially hedge the risk among the utilities, including LADWP. That is one of our recommendations that we had. Let's go to slide 27. Now we'll go to GHG emissions. This slide, the chart shows how much GHG emission is expected based on NREL numbers. Remember, we're starting at 12.8 million metric tons in 2020, which is the high end of the chart. And if you look at all the different lines, you can see that every one of the lines drops significantly through 2030, and then it's kind of staled after that. The stale just shows that you're getting most of the GHG emission reduction benefits through 2030 or 2035. Now, what's causing this is that the retirement of coal. Out of the 12.8 million metric tons of GHG emission today from the power sector, roughly 11 metric tons, or 90% of that, is direct combustion. The remaining 10% is the non-combustion, which is outside of LADWP's control. You can't do anything about it. So we want to focus on that 11 million metric tons. Out of the 11 million metric tons, roughly 8 million metric tons, or 70%, is from coal. So by retiring coal, you're getting the biggest, lowest hanging fruit and reducing about 2/3 or even 70% of the total emissions that you have today. After that, you're reducing something from 4 to 5 to 2 to 3. It becomes very, very difficult and expensive as well. This also shows that you're getting most of the benefits within the next 10 years. After 10 years, there's a lot of uncertainty, as we saw in the cost curve earlier, that the cost tends to grow exponentially and diverge by pathways. Let's go to slide 30. So slide 30 shows what the cost is to reduce carbon. In 2025, the cost for reducing carbon is about $1,000 per ton, per metric ton. That grows to about $7,000 by 2045. You can see how the cost grows exponentially, partially because, as we saw in the earlier slides, you're not reducing much after 2030 or 2035. The cost tends to go up exponentially after 2030 or 2045. Now let's go to the next slide. However, with that said, there is something that you may want to be aware of. We've been talking about the cost and looking at the emission reductions, but emission reduction on a given year may not be what you want to target. Because when you think about greenhouse gas emissions and the harm they cause, it's not about how much you emit in a given year or how much you emitted in a given month. It's the total amount of greenhouse gas that's up there. So if you emit a ton today, that ton's going to stay around for a long, long time. But if you avoid a ton today, that ton will not be there. So there is a saying in saying it is that it's better to reduce carbon GHG emission earlier rather than later. But then there's a balance with cost, which is the difficult part that LADWP has to deal with. The example that I show in the lower right-hand chart shows how a faster and shallower reduction, shown in the orange line, can reduce more GHG emissions than a slower and deeper decarbonization shown in the green line. And in this case, if we look at the time frame between 2020 and 2050, the faster and shallower option reduces, give or take, 7,000 million metric tons more carbon than the slower and deeper. Now, if you expand this time frame all the way to 2100, obviously the slower and deeper will perhaps lead to higher total emission reduction, but you need to balance that the fact that once you emit GHG, it sticks around in the air versus what the cost is today versus what the cost is tomorrow. That is a very tricky issue, and there's no good science to it. Next slide. So earlier we looked at what the total cost was in terms of reducing GHG emission. Here we'll look at the average cost for the cumulative GHG reduction. And if you look at the numbers, you can see that the cost is within the $200 to $300 range with a slight difference among the different pathways. But what's common is that the unit cost, that is the dollars per ton of reduction, is lower in the high load scenarios. The high load scenarios are the ones with the circles. The sorry, and the moderate ones are the ones with the triangles. And you can see that in most years. Well, let me pause here and go to the next slide because the other slide is perhaps easier to explain that. Or was it that slide? Still, we go to 37. Okay. What was I thinking? Oh, yes. So in most cases, the per unit cost of the high scenario is less than the moderate scenario, and it shows that the additional electrification is only going to cost you about 15 to 20% more than what you would have paid if you did not pay for the additional electrification. So let's go to slide 40. So here it is. That's flipped to the chart that we looked at earlier. What is the unit cost of the total GHG reduction by the different pathways? As you can see here, the on a per unit basis, on a reduction basis, the high load pathways that has the circles in the middle typically show a lower cost than the moderate pathways that has a triangle on it. And the delta is about 15 or 20% of the cost, meaning that that is where the low hanging fruit is. You can, so the short story is you can invest another $150 to $200 per metric ton to reduce emission from the power sector, or you can reduce, or you can spend 20 to 30 bucks per ton and reduce the same amount of GHG reduction from the other sectors, the transportation or the buildings. So you can see how electrification is helping in that sense. Next slide. What these two charts show is how much you get GHG emission from the combined sectors of power, building, and transportation. The bar chart on the left shows how much you are emitting under the moderate pathway. Today, the power sector emits about 12.8 million metric tons. The total emission from the power sector, the building, and the transportation is about 35 million metric tons. That, with the moderate load scenario, goes down to about a combined 16 million metric tons, with the power sector being reduced from 12.8 down to 2.9. So the power sector is reduced by about 10, but the total sector is only coming down to about half. If you go to the right-hand side, you can see that with the high load, the power sector emission is actually higher than the moderate load. So if you look at 2045, the power sector emission is 4.1 compared to 2.9 in the moderate load. So it's about 1.5 times. But the total emission, the height of the bar, is now about 7, or much less than half of what it was in the moderate load scenario. This is for the SB100 scenario, but the point here is that by focusing on electrification of the other sectors, yes, the emission from the power sector goes up slightly, but the reduction from the other sectors are much more significant to more than offset that little increase in the power sector. So you can see that in the right-hand chart, for the emissions from the building sector goes down pretty much close to zero. The building sectors are the blue and the green in the bar. In the SB100 load scenario, you don't see that for 2045. And the transportation sector also goes from about 10 million metric tons in 2045 down to about 2.5 to 3. So it's important to note that other sectors have a much more bigger bang for the buck compared to the power sector. Next slide. We did the same thing with the early and no biofuel pathways because this was the most aggressive pathways. Again, the story is the same. If you look at 2045, the power sector reduction, the power sector emission of 0.58 increases under the high load scenario to 1.85 by roughly 50%. But the combined emissions from the fourth sector goes down from about 14.5 down to less than 5. So again, it's going down to a third of the emission. If you just focus on the power sector, you're going to be focused on the 0.58 and 0.85 and not on the 15 versus 4. So it's important that you look into the transportation sector and the building sector. Next slide. So there was a question about barbecues, and I don't know how what people have in their backyard. So this may not be directly to barbecues, but this shows what happens with the gas consumption. The red bars shows the amount of investment that DWP is going to be putting in for the renewable PPAs. So in the moderate load scenario for SB100, you're spending about $35 billion by 2045 for the renewable PPAs. In the high load scenario on the right-hand side, you're spending about 38 billion, so about a 10% increase. If you look at the amount of natural gas you're using, which is the blue line, and it's looking at the right axis, in the moderate load scenario, you're starting at about 350 million BTUs per year, and that's only going down to about 300 or 280 million BTUs by 2045. If you look at the right-hand side chart, the starting point is about 300 million BTUs in 2025. There's a reduction already from 2020 to 2025. But the total amount that you're using natural gas in 2045 is down to 15 million BTUs. That is also another way of confirming that the reduction that we see with higher electrification is real, because you're significantly reducing the amount of natural gas you're using. Next slide. So this slide summarizes what we observed in the cost and carbon reduction. The key messages: the costs through 2030 are roughly contained and aligned with SLTRP 2017 modified. Then it starts growing exponentially and starts diverging. A lot of the emission benefits are done through 2030. So after that, you're spending a lot of money without having incremental benefits of carbon reduction. Transmission seems to be a solid investment option because it gives you more options and contributes to EJ issues. On the other hand, the renewable CTs, while we understand the need for LADWP to start looking into those because they are the technologies of the future in case something else fails, is at this point relatively high expenditure while their utilization is not that high. And obviously, as we repeated multiple times, the electrification of the other sectors with transportation and building are as important as the power sector, especially it leads to higher overall reduction looking at the combined sector and leads to higher health benefits and also contributes more to the reduction. But one of the caveat, as I said earlier, is that NREL did not assume any costs associated with the electrification. So that is something that we may want to look into and compare as we go forward. That is the summary of the cost and reduction. I know I've got another 20 minutes, so I'll pause here and see if there's any questions, but if not, we'll go to the next sections.
Bruce, this is Ann. Can I ask you one question?
Yes.
What type of energy are you assuming we're going to deliver to the electrification and transportation and building stock? Is that natural gas fired, energy, or is that renewable electricity?
That is all renewable as well. So SB 100 says you have to have 100% retail sales, and the power that you deliver to the electrified vehicles and the houses and the buildings are all served by LADWP. We're assuming it's all served by LADWP, so that's also going to be renewable.
Can I actually kind of ask a question or clarify? Because SB 100, not that I'm a fan of them, allows use of renewable energy credits. And that means if you're running gas-fired generation, you can do it with RECs. You can cover it with RECs. And actually, one of the big questions that's being raised here is the huge cost of the exotic technology, as you call it, of green hydrogen fueled combustion turbines versus simply, if you only run 5% of the time, what's wrong with running them with natural gas, which of course is against the religion, but from a cost-effective standpoint and reducing the cost of electricity, which is one of the costs of electrification, may make a lot of sense. And also, we have to end at 10. And so if you don't finish before 10, we'll have no chance for questions.
Okay. But Tony,
can I ask a
clarification? Yes.
question too? Can I ask a quick question? On slide 43, in past IRPs, SLTRP, we've always focused on fuel switching, where electricity absorbs a lot of the petroleum use from electrification. So here it's focused on natural gas, but would it be prudent to layer on the savings from reduced petroleum and diesel usage? Because that's a huge component. The carbon intensity of petroleum is double that of natural gas.
Yes, and we can try that if we can find the data in NREL study. I don't recall seeing it, but maybe it's there. I think I said this at the very beginning, but at the bottom of every slide, we have listed the data source and their specific site. So if people wanted to replicate the analysis that we put up here, it should be relatively straightforward. Maybe not as straightforward, but at least we're trying to maintain transparency. But Jay, I hear you. Let us look at to see if there's any numbers on oil consumption.
And actually, it does give an opportunity for SLTRP to provide some of those comparisons that may not be here. So there's another layer of what we can do.
Yeah, I have a quick question about green hydrogen in Utah. Or if it's an unproven technology, or green hydrogen is going to be very expensive, won't that have a significant impact on the power coming from Utah? I don't know whether that's in your realm, but it seems to me that would be pretty rugged.
Jack, to the best of my knowledge, I think they're starting with mixing green hydrogen with natural gas in Utah, not directly going into that. So it's like mixing ethanol in your gasoline and see if it works. So the cost impact at 10% range is relatively limited, just as we saw ethanol not impacting the gas prices too much.
I had a question about the greenhouse gas emission. That 12.8 ton, is that total put out, or is that in the Los Angeles basin that you're talking about?
That is what DWP assumes came out from the power sector. So I think it includes everything.
But that doesn't mean that's in Los Angeles County. So your comment was on cutting back on coal. So that's basically emissions outside of Los Angeles. So what is the greenhouse gas effect in Los Angeles? That's a question. Is that answerable?
Well, actually, earlier they had a slide which showed the health benefits in particulates. And so that actually showed that the transportation sector is where most of the health benefits are going to come from, not in the reduction of gas-fired generation.
But again, I would like to know what the starting point in Los Angeles is. What is because the reductions you're basing on is a total power, which is really now it's reflected in Los Angeles.
Greenhouse gases don't have a direct local health impact.
Oh.
Greenhouse gases have a worldwide climate change impact.
So then we should look at the total greenhouses in the world to see what this is. If you want to say it's worldwide, then we should look at total greenhouse gas effect.
For every coal plant that we kill,
do.
India builds another. That's the reality of this.
It's ridiculous. That's what it is. Anyway.
Bruce, why don't we go on to the next section?
Okay, let's go to the rate section. So this slide, I think you are all familiar with, was provided by the FSO and the LADWP Financial Services Office, and I commend and Jimmy and folks who developed this. But it shows that the orange line in the middle is what retail rates would be if you assume a 2.5% growth along with the projected inflation rate. And as you see in most scenarios or pathways, the rates will be under the 2.5 growth rate if you allow that to happen. But just like every other utility investment, you're increasing the rates in the early half, and then the rates tend to become flatter in the later half. One more interesting observation is that the rates under the high load for pathways are typically lower than the moderate load pathways by 10 or 15%. And that's because you're not only reducing more carbon emissions, but the rate is how much you spend divided by the user group. And that user group becomes larger when you have higher load. And as a result, the per unit cost or the cents per kilowatt hour becomes lower in the high load pathways. Another reason to advocate for electrifying other sectors. Next slide. So this this slide shows how the compound annual growth rate is. But as you see in the most right-hand side chart, side of the table, the compound annual growth rate between now and 2045 is within the 2.5 range. But again, if you compare the top half of the table to the bottom half of the table, the top half shows the moderate loads, the bottom half shows the high load pathways. The high load pathways compound annual growth rate of the rates is about half 0.5% lower per year than the moderate load. I think it's another indication that a wider, an approach that looks at other sectors beyond the power sector will actually benefit the rate growth as well, or reduce the rate growth as well. Next slide. Now, the rate is not carved in stone. There's a lot of uncertainty going on with the rates. So what we show here is the uncertainty associated with the pathways. So if you look at the moderate load pathways, there's four different scenarios, and then there's SLTRP moderate. But if you look at the pathways, the rate difference in 2045 is about 7 cents, depending on the pathways. If you look at the impact of the load that you're projecting, the rate impact is about 3.5 cents in 2045. What's important here is that in both cases, the deviation starts around 2030. So if you look at right-hand side chart, for example, the rate is roughly consist among different loads through 2030, and then it varies. So you can see that there's give or take 7 cents difference by the scenario, and 3.5 cents difference by the load. But that's not the end of the story. Let's go to the next slide. The 3.5 cents can actually grow. So what we've shown on the right-hand slide is what happens if you plan for a high load scenario. So you make the investment saying, okay, I'm going to get this much of electrification and so on and so forth. But all of a sudden, the realized load was at the moderate level. That can happen, and that's out of LADWP's control as well. In that case, the rate impact is about 6 cents, which is roughly the same amount that you have with the selection of the scenarios. So the uncertainty of load or realizing load that comes afterwards is equivalent to the uncertainty of selecting your scenario. Next slide. So that's all summarized here, that again, the rates tend to grow similar through 2030, but the rates all through 2045 are going to be less than the assumed 2.5 inflation rate, but the rates will grow exponentially earlier and then flatten out in the later years. But there's uncertainty associated with these rates because it's not carved in stone. Furthermore, even if you were to choose a scenario, there's uncertainty associated with the load coming on or not coming on, and so on. And so we just wanted to highlight that there's a lot of uncertainty, especially as you go on after 2030. And it's very, very difficult to even estimate what the rates would be for different customer classes with so much variability here. Next slide. So that was the rate. Now we talked about the uncertainty of the load. So we'll go on to talk about uncertainties of other stuff, including the load. The chart on the left shows the annual energy consumption projection used by NREL for the LA100 study, and the right-hand side shows the peak load projection used by the LA100 study. The NEL is the actual numbers from 2020 in the orange triangle. So you can see that in the energy consumption, the NEL shows a lower energy consumption than what NREL assumed, and the peak is higher than what NREL assumed. keep that in mind. It's slightly, but keep that in mind. Next slide. Skip this and let's go to the next one. So what that means is if you look at what's called the load factor, the load factor is what is the share of average load against the peak. The higher the load factor, the flatter your load. That means the higher the load factor, you're running more like an industrial process where you don't change your usage within the day. The lower the load factor, that means you're kind of switching on and off your appliances as you need. A higher load factor or a flatter load requires less flexibility because if everyone was running their appliance 24/7, LA DWP will not have to ramp up their power plants or shut down their power plants. But because people have different usage patterns, they need that flexibility. So a higher load factor means you need less flexibility and potentially you are curtailing less renewables. Both of these will lead to underestimating costs. And if you look at what the load factors are that the LA 100 study assumed, which is in the bigger red triangle here in the left-hand chart, they're in the 55 to 60% range. Compared to the average load factor that we observed in 2017 through 2019, which is less than 50%. So that caught our eyes. We're not saying that the NREL team did not do a thorough job in creating the loads. We're just reporting what we observed in their analysis. So there's a potential that the flexibility needs and the total cost is underestimated. Next slide. And then there's the uncertainty associated with the costs. This chart shows the cost of power from new power plants between 2009 and 2019. You can see that the power cost from PV went down by 90%, as seen in the orange line. Gas peakers went down by 40%. On the other hand, nuclear plants went up by 30%. So even within the 10 years, which you think you know pretty much what's going to happen, there's a huge range and change in what the cost of generation would be. Next slide. Now, we looked at the NREL studies, and a separate NREL study shows that the cost of PV went down by 80% over the last 5 years. On the other hand, if you look at what NREL assumed for PVs, depending on the type of PVs, but for the rooftops, they're assuming there's going to be an 80% cost reduction over 25 years. And for utility scale PV, they're assuming that there's going to be a 70% cost reduction over 25 years. Now, if we go back to the left-hand slide, that shows that there were 80% reduction in PV installations. And in the previous slide, we showed that there was a 90% reduction over the past 10 years. So while the magnitude of the drop is similar, the amount of years it takes to get that is quite significantly longer in the NREL study. Now, we understand that there's no crystal ball that looks at this, but it shows the uncertainty that if the change in costs were to move a lot faster than what NREL predicts, then the future year prediction that NREL analyzed may not be as accurate as they wish it could be. Next slide. And finally, earlier we said that NREL assumes there's going to be 3 to 4 gigawatts of rooftop solars installed by individual customers or commercial customers or whatnots. The two charts shows how much NREL assumes rooftop solar to be put by scenario by residential customers and by commercial and industrial customers. They add up to about 3 to 4 gigawatts. But a lot of that is expanding in the later half, 2030 and after. Now, by 2030, you've got a pretty clean grid. We showed that 80% or 90% of the GHG emission is achieved by that time. Why would people install additional rooftops after that happens is a question that I had. So that is another uncertainty that we may want to consider. Next slide. One more thing is if you look at the amount of PPAs that are being signed in the NREL study, which is the right-hand side chart, you can see that in most scenarios by 2030, they're assuming that somewhere between 50 and 70% of the PPAs the renewable the PPAs from renewables are signed by that time. So when you have that much additional renewables, the question is, will people still add rooftop solar to their house because the value that comes from that rooftop solar may not be justified? Next slide. Speaking of the value, the chart on the left shows what happened in Ontario between 2005 and 2017. I know LA DWP is not, well, you're joining CAISO, but it's not like a full-fledged LMP market. But what happened in Ontario as they went to increase renewables with a combination of lower gas prices is that the power price went down by 80%. And there's roughly about 2,500 hours of zero or negative priced hours, which means your solar power that's being generated at that time is not worth anything in terms of monetary values. We also see the same thing for CAISO. The upper right-hand chart shows what the power prices were for the second Sunday in April for 2012, 17, and 20. In 2012, the prices were hovering around $20 to $30 throughout the day. But by 2017, because of the huge surge in solar, the prices between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. are roughly in the negative range. We observed the same thing for 2020. The chart at the bottom shows what is causing that. The black or the gray bar lines show what the generation is from wind and solar. Largely because solar picks up at about 7 or 8 a.m. There's a huge surcharge of renewable power flowing into the system. And as a result, the price, which is in the blue line, dips to zero. See the y-axis on the right-hand side at about 8 or 9 a.m. and then it stays at zero until 4 or 5 p.m. So the wholesale market energy price during the daytime when you have solar is zero, which means if the wholesale price and the retail prices are somewhat to be linked, there's very, very small incentives for people to invest more in rooftops after the 2030 timeframe that NREL was assuming would happen. Next slide. And then there's the uncertainty of adoption. The left-hand chart shows how people adopted different technologies, whether it's flushing toilets or running water, vacuum machines, color TVs, and whatnot. In all of these cases, you can see that it starts slow and then all of a sudden it picks up. We don't know what the pickup rate be for electrification or for electric vehicles. So we compare what we thought would be comparable to other projected EV sales and the NREL scenarios. Looking at the high load scenario, the high load scenario is expected to achieve 80% electric vehicles by 2045. If I simply pull a linear line between 2045 and today, that means it's gonna try to reach about 11% by 2030. The moderate scenario assumes 30% by 2045. So again, if I just linearize it between today and 2045, that's about 8% in 2030. Now, we don't know.
Could you wrap up in about a minute or two because we are almost at the end?
Yeah. So we're uncertain about that. So let's go to the next slide. Skip this one. So let's go to the summary of the observation. The long story short is that the cost goes up after 2030. The marginal benefits of carbon reduction is not there after 2030. And therefore, and the uncertainty grows after 2030. Uncertainty includes the low growth, the cost of new technologies, the way things will develop, among other things. So one of the recommendations is to focus on the first 10 years. The other recommendation is that electrification is very important. It leads to a much higher benefit of health benefits for everybody. And it leads to lower cost of carbon, lower cost per ton of carbon reduction. And it also leads to lower rates. So rather than focus on the power sector where it's already pretty much cleaned up, we should look into the electrification of the other sectors. And unfortunately, NREL did not include any of the costs associated with electrifying the transportation sector or the building sector. Now, what to focus on the next 10 years is obviously you still want to develop your understanding of the new technologies, but focus on what you know is worth going. And transmission is perhaps one of those that LED DWP has a very good handle of what the costs are and how they can develop it. And yet it takes a long lead time. So don't procrastinate anything on transmission. It helps in both the short term and long term, and also helps on EJ issues because you're increasing your optionality value by building transmission. That would be the summary that I added in the last 3 slides.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Clearly, we're going to have to schedule another session. Let me point out, though, that after 5 years of discussing this with no discussion of costs, we've had one advisory group session in which NML finally discussed cost and let some great cats out of the bag, which we need to talk about. And we've had this session where the ratepayer advocates brought his preliminary findings of his office. And so obviously it's too much to pack into 2 sessions, but I want to thank Fred Pickle. I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank the department for providing this platform. And I agree with Camden and others, Tony Butka, and so that we need to have another session to further go into this and allow some questions. But I think this was very successful. We've recorded the meeting. I'll try and find a place separate to put it. And thank you very much to everybody.
Tony, can I add one sentence?
Sure.
Remember my conversations about the power industry capital expenditure timeline. As we look at this, right now we have to be building what we will be using in the next 5 years from now. In 5 to 10 years, we have to be doing the serious planning, detailed planning, and beginning of permitting for what we're going to have 10 years from now. So, and this study, the NREL study, focuses on 2030 and after. So we have to be very serious about the SLTRP, but also focused on the short term of what are we going to need to have in place 5 years from now as once through cooling gets increasingly restricted.
One of the benefits of this approach of yours, thank you very much, is that while there is some skepticism about the 2045 projections and the later costs, there is actually great support for the people, all of our friends in the environmental community that would like to act quickly to take advantage of these earlier and less expensive benefit wins. So I think we've got a lot positive to talk about when we have our next meeting. So thank you all.
Tony, I just got one thing is,
Sure.
Bruce, I thought you did a very good job of sort of talking about what was in all these 84 pages. When I read the 84 pages yesterday, I think I was about ready to strangle Fred Pickle. But I thought, just going through this in the hour and a half, I think, or hour and 45 minutes, I thought you did, or hour and a half, I thought you did a very nice job. So thank you.
You nearly got an email that said, Jack, wait for the audio.
Good night. Bye.
Great meeting. Thank you all. We'll see you some other time soon.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.